Alright, so in this video we're going to learn how to build robust forms in NextJs 15 using server actions, the new useActionState hook, Zod for validation, and at the end we're going to also add bot protection and rate limiting to our form, which is really interesting because now we're going to add those to our server actions. Previously on the channel I've talked about rate limiting, but that's for API endpoints or your API routes, but this time we're going to implement rate limiting and bot protection against our server actions. So let me show you what we're going to end up, or the finished product first, and then we're going to jump into the code and build this together. So as you can see, it's a simple to-do list or a form to create to-do tasks. But the concepts that we're going to go through can be applied to more complex forms. So let's add something here, learn, let's say NextJs. It's going to add that, revalidate this path, show a toast notification. It has Zod validation in that if I just don't provide any title, it says it is required. So let's say learn server actions. And if I keep adding tasks here, I just want to show you the bot protection as well. That kicks in and says 2-minute registration attempts, please try again. So I think this is really interesting, and we're going to build this from scratch using the useActionState, which is the new name that we have for useFormState that we had in prior versions of NextJS before React 19 was stabilized, which is now stable. We have talked about it before on the channel. It's very similar. It's a very similar API. There has been slight changes in the way that the form works and refreshes anytime that this server action is submitted. And also it's also giving you one more state or one more piece of data from the return of the hook that we're going to see together. But if you have been working with the useFormState before, it is very similar to that. We have covered it. There's a video on the channel as well, and I'm going to point it in the description as well. So if you wanted to compare, you have an idea there. So let's just go to the code, and I'm going to stop this dev server, and I'm going to just come back to our unfinished project here, pm dev. The link into the source code is also available for you in the description, so you can just go down there. While we're at it here, let's also delete our to-do tasks. I'm going to explain from a high level what we're doing here, and then we're going to build from this point on. If you are following along, if you go to the repository that's linked in the description below, let me just show that as well real quick. It's called Next Forms, and there is different commits on this. The first commit, which is the initial setup, is going to take you or bring you back to this initial state that we're going to start building up from. Now, as far as what we have right now, this is what we get out of the box. For the page, I have added a new to-do form. This is what we're going to use to add a to-do. Right now, it only has an input from ShadCN. I'm using ShadCN components. If you want to know how to add ShadCN to NextJS 15, there's a video on the channel linked in the card and also in the description. You can follow along with that to learn implementing ShadCN in NextJS. And then we have a to-do list, which is basically fetching to-dos from our database, which I'm going to talk about right now, shortly in a second, and just maps over each one of them, show a to-do item. And this to-do item just basically shows a checkbox as label and the date, just like what you have seen over here. Right now, I have not hooked this up to actually update the to-do, but you can apply the same thing that we are going to build to actually create a new to-do to updating them as well. We have the functions. I just didn't hook it up. So you can continue with that. We're not going to do much updates on the to-do item here. So let's go back to our page and to this form. Before continuing to build on this form, I want to mention that I'm using Prisma. So I've installed already Prisma. I'm using MongoDB, as you just saw from my database. I have a schema or a table for my to-dos with a title and is completed property that is the Boolean to say if this task is completed or not. You're going to see a .env.example. You're going to need your database URL. This is what Prisma uses to connect there's a connection string that Prisma uses to connect to your database. Later on, we're going to add Arcjet for bot protection and rate limiting. you would need to have the key over here as well. I've already copied them in my .env so that I don't have to pause the video for that. Now, as far as working with to-dos, we have this Prisma, which is basically exporting or sharing a Prisma client on the global objects for local development, so we don't recreate this Prisma client. The to-dos is all the functions that work with our to-do table to get to-dos, create one, updating one, and getting one by ID. Again, down under the hood, it's using Prisma, the to-do table, and find many to create one and to update one, and you get the idea. So I have all of these functions inside of my lib to-dos. The utils is just the format date and the cn function that comes from chat-cn to merge tailwind utility classes. Okay, so I think this is a good starting point for us. Let's just go to our page. We have the new to-do form. Now, right now, this doesn't do anything. So the form is not hooked up to any action. It's just an input with a type submit button, and this is our starting point now. So the first thing that I want to do is to hook this up with our useActionState and add a server action to be able to actually create a new to-do. And as we're going along, we're going to add verification, validation, and then at the end, the bot protection. So let's bring in our hook. Now, the useActionState hook is going to give you a state, a form action, and is pending state. This is when your form is actually being submitted. So let's get useActionState from React. Now this is where it is different from useFormState. useFormState was not exposing this is pending. You actually had a different hook that was called useFormStatus that hooks into the status of the parent form and tells you if it is pending or not. If you wanted to, let's say, render something different or disable your button when the form was pending. So let's just do this. If it is pending, we're going to set adding, and if not, add task. That's the first thing that we're going to do. Now, to this useActionState, you need to pass in two things. One is a server action that runs on the server and actually executes this mutation to create a new task. And the second item or prop or argument that you're passing into this hook is the initial state. Now, as I mentioned, this returns three values. The first value is the state. That's in the first time around, it's going to be the initial state that you pass in here. And then after each submission, when you execute the server action, this state is going to be what you return from your server action. And we're going to see this in action again. We're going to pass a success message or an error message if that to-do creation encounters any errors. And this form action is what you would pass in to your action prop or to your form's action prop. Okay, so let's actually create an action that we can pass in here. So we're going to go to the lib and create actions file.ts. You can also add these actions to your app. I'm following this new convention where I just add this to my lib folder. So use server up top. This is going to now mark every async function that you export from this file as a server action. So we're going to call this create to do action. We're going to come back to what this receives. Well, while we're at it, let's just do it. So it just receives the previous state and also the form data. Okay, so the form data is just of type form data. And this is state, let's just say unknown for now, but we're going to type this later on. Okay, so right now we're not going to do any ZOD validation or any other protection. It's just that processing this form data that we are receiving to create a new to-do. So what I'm going to do is to get the title from our form data. And then what we're going to do, we're going to use this create to-do that we have that expects the title to create a new to-do item. All right. So let's actually hook everything up inside of a try catch and bring this up top. So what I'm going to say is that I'm going to say get the title, and I'm going to await calling create to do and then passing in the title. If any error happens, I'm going to return, let's say something went wrong, and then if it is successful, I'm going to return a success that says task added successfully. Now here you can look into this error. It's unknown because in JavaScript you can pretty much throw anything. And here what I can say is if my error is as error, I'm going to see if there's a message. Otherwise, I'm going to see an error occurred. And what I want to do finally is I want to revalidate. So revalidate path from next cache. Yep, we got this. So whether we succeed or not, I want to revalidate the path. I'm revalidating the homepage because this is just living at the homepage right now. Okay. So let's go back, and now we need to pass in our server action to this useActionState. So we're going to bring create to do action, and then our initial state. Now, if you go back to the action, you can see this state that's returned from this. It's an object with a success property or optionally an error property. So this is state really, if I want to type this, to do action, or let's say to do state, it's either success, optionally string, or error, right? So this is the type of this state, or the return value of this create to do. So there I can also initiate this to have the same thing with a success and an error. So let's save this. Create to do, use action state, and this is state. Is declare about the value. What is the error here? Let's see. Give me a second over here. All right. The way that we are returning this, I guess, if we were to here say error, this would have worked the other way around too. So it works when our error is undefined, so no errors here, and then we have to use the state here. So let's say anytime that we have a state, we want to show a toast notification. All right, so let's just get this. So anytime that this state changes is one way of doing it. Let's get the use effect, and down here we can say if it is success, we show a success message. If it is not, then we do that. But instead of alert, I want to use shatcn toast notification. So let's go shatcn in the components. Let's make this a bit bigger. We have sonar, which is a nice toast notification. So let's get sonar, and all you need to do is to bring in the toaster into your main layout and then use the toast function to actually trigger a toast notification. So let's stop to this server and add sonar. Restart the dev server, and let's go back. We're going to get the toaster, and let's go to our layout, And then let's wrap our children inside of a main. And then bring in our toaster here. I like to set the position to be top right so we can actually see the toast notifications. And here I just want to say toast.success. And this toast needs to come in from Sonar. And in terms of an error, we're going to say toast.error and then state.error. So as you can see here, we are using this useActionState form just to show you or explain one more time what it does is that it takes in a server action. This is the function we defined on the server using this useServer directive, an asynchronous function that you define on the server, and you can call it from client side. These are what server actions are. If you don't know what server actions are, there is a video on the channel where I dive very deep into what they are and how to use them, and how it also ties into what React 19 has in terms of server actions and functions that you can expose to the client side. So definitely watch that video if this is not very comfortable. But basically, at a high level, they're just functions you define on the server, but you can call them from client side. Under the hood, they create a post API endpoint. So when you execute this function from this form, basically they are executing an API endpoint. So instead of you having to wire that up to handle the form submission, it creates that API endpoint under the hood and submits this form data for you. And that's why we need to also worry about security, validation, and bot protection and all that we do usually for API endpoints. Just because this is a function doesn't mean it is secure. It's still a public API endpoint. It's just that it's easier now to create. You don't have to wire that up yourself. It just creates that API endpoint on your behalf, but you have to validate the data. If it is needed to be an authenticated endpoint, you need to authenticate this endpoint, check for authentications here. We have videos where we talk about authentications using Clerk and authenticating our server actions here. But you get the idea. It's a public endpoint. If somebody gets the ID of this specific server action, they can basically call that API endpoint. There has been some improvements in NextJs 15 in terms of making it harder to get that ID. But at the end of the day, this is a public API endpoint, and you should validate the data that comes from the client. You should authenticate the user if it needs be. And later on with Arcjet, we're going to protect it against bots and spam attacks or rate limiting. So when we're successful, we show a toast notification. If there is an error, we show the error message. Let's try this out for a second. And this should work in terms of creating a new to-do, but also when something goes wrong. So let's go back to our app. Okay, the first error that we're getting, we're using a hook inside of our form that we need to mark this as a client component. So let's go up top and mark this as a client component because we're using a React hook. Let's also tidy this up so we have the components at the bottom. All right, so let's see if this solves our problem here. All right, so we have our form back. If I say learn server actions, we have the server actions created, we have the toast notification, and we had the pending state here inside of the button as well. If you paid attention, it happened so fast, but because now this useActionState gives us and is pending, you could just literally tie this into disabling this button or showing a different text as what we're doing here. So far, we have hooked up our form using this useActionState that takes in a server action that we defined on the server that we can call it now from the client side. It took an initial state, which is now the value of this state returned. This is usually used to capture the return value of your server action. For example, a success message, an error message, or anything else. You can also return the data. So when you are creating a new to-do here, you can get that to-do object and actually return it to the client side. Anything that you can serialize that can be returned from your server actions back to your client side. So it can be anything really. Here, we're just using it as a success and error message, but you can pass in anything that can be turned into a string back to the client. Because remember, server actions are running on the server, and the return value to go across the network needs to be in the shape of a string, and you can just return it back to here, which is going to be your new state. Now you can use that inside of your form or to show notifications like we are doing. The return value was a form action. This is the form action that you pass into the action prop of your form, and then an is pending state, which just tells you that if the form submission is still in transition, so you can disable the buttons and decide, what the UI, how your UI looks like depending on this state. Okay. Now, as the first step or the next step, I want to add client-side validation. So I want to validate that they are actually passing in the correct format of this title. Now, this can be different fields and different forms for more complex forms, but the idea is the same thing. We're going to use Zod for validation. So let's go ahead and install Zod. So I'm going to stop the dev server. pm add Zod. Let's rerun the dev server. And inside of my lib, I'm going to create a file called schemas.ts. I'm going to import z from Zod, and then I'm going to create export const let's say new to do schema, which is a z object with a title of string. The non-empty does not work, so min title must be at least 1 character long. So the only validation I have, let's say, is that I want them to provide. Let's also put in a max to say, I don't know, maximum of 100. So it needs to be a string. It is required. This is the new way of saying required. The non-empty, it's deprecated in Zod, so you can say minimum 1. And it says title is required, and then a maximum characters. All right. So we want to use this Zod to validate the data on the client side before we are invoking our server action. So if it is not valid, we don't want to invoke our server action. The next step is that we're going to also use Zod to do the same thing on the server action. So even though we have validated the data on the client side, we want to also validate it on the server side. So we're going to do that next. So here, let's see how can we actually do this. Now, when we are using actions and form actions, this is not really like your handle submit, where you could create a function and pass it to the submit handler of a form, where you would perform validations. It's a bit different. So what we can do here is actually create our own hook over here, or function. So I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call this form action. And then this form action, what it is going to do is going to validate the data, and it is going to then call this function here. Now, for the naming convention, I want to call this dispatch, like the dispatch function that we know and use from useReducer in React. So this is basically dispatching our form data that triggers this server action. Now I'm going to call this dispatch from here. And I'm going to pass it the form data that I receive here. So this, all right, let me explain what has happened. So instead of just passing in this dispatch which I was naming it form actions, directly to the action prop, I'm just creating a middleware function here, and I'm passing it to the action prop. And from here, I can validate the data, then call this dispatch, which then does whatever it was using or it was doing before with the useActionState. Okay, so this allows me to also validate the data here. So let's create the data. Object.entries, form.entries. This is turning the form data that's submitted in the shape of a form data to our form into an object. Now I can use our schema, which is called new to do schema. And let's just save parse the data. If no success, I'm going to show an error message. Sure, and return. Otherwise, or if it is valid, then I'm going to dispatch call the dispatch function with this form data, which triggers our server action. So we have successfully validated this data on the client side. So let's see this in action for a second. Let me go back, refresh, and if I submit the form without any task, we added the task successfully because I haven't saved this. So let's go back and refresh. Now it is showing me an error. So instead of getting this, I think result.error, there is going to be an errors. Yeah, that message. Let's just show this instead. Let's just refresh the button and add. So title is required. Now here you can do something else as well. So you can create an state for this and say validation errors. And this can be in the shape of an object that right now has a title property and there's no validation error. So this is something also you can do, and this is what you're going to find inside the code. So here, instead of just showing a toast notification, I can just go ahead and set validation error to that message. And down here, I can just say if the validation.title is there, let's just show this guy. Let's just put them inside of a div as well. Let's just give this a class of width full. Sorry. So if I submit now, it just shows it down here. The decision is yours how you really want to show it. You get the idea. The whole point is to keep track of this validation client side. So you can have a local state. You could show a toast notification as we were doing here. Doesn't really matter, but you get the idea. Now, one thing that matters though, if you are using a state, so if I submit this form and there is an error, if I start typing in here and even after I submit, this error still stays here. So you need to then hook this up with an onChange and maybe say validate, and then create a function that says validate, that takes in an event, and we don't need to pick. Let's go safe parse. And here, maybe we can just, we could do that. It is going to set title to the value. If no success, we're going to set validation error. So what is the error here? You know what I can do here is to create data. It is going to be title, that value. Then I'm going to use the title or use the data here. And then if there is an error, I'm going to set the title. Otherwise, I'm just going to set it back to being nothing. And I'm not really using this name. You can just limit this to only check if the name is to do, but you get the idea. So now, if I start typing, that error goes away. So we are just watching for the changes on the input and revalidating the form to just remove the error message if there is anything. So let's review what we have done so far. What I have added is an intermediary function here, form action, that calls that dispatch, which then allowed me to do my client-side validation with Zod to see if I have the correct information, then call the dispatch, which is going to trigger our server action. If it's not valid, we're going to return either by showing a toast notification or setting some local state to show the error to the user. All right. Now, let's implement the same Zod validation on the server side, because again, as I mentioned, your server action is a public API endpoint, and you should never trust anything that comes from the client. So you should always treat this as something unsafe that you need to then validate. So we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to say const data, sure, but before we do this, let's just say result is going to be, yep, safe parse. And if it is not successful, so if result dot success doesn't exist, we're going to return an error. And let's get this new to-do schema. So very convenient. We added this schema. We can validate our data on the client side using this schema and do the same thing on the action, parsing the data that's coming into our server action. If there is any errors, I'm going to pass in the errors. Otherwise, I'm going to get the title out of it and create my to-do. All right. So let's test and see if everything is working. Let me go back and actually delete these unnecessary to-dos that we have here and the one that's actually empty. All right, so let's go back here, learn server actions, and boom, everything is working properly. If I don't submit anything, it just shows an error and then removes the error, shows me the notifications as well. Okay, so far we're good. Now in the last step, what I want to do is add Arcjet to protect our forms against bots, spams, rate limit our form. Now, if you're not familiar with Arcjet, we had a video on the channel where I introduced what it is and the different levels of protection that it provides. So I'm going to include a link in the description and also in the card somewhere. So you watch that video first to understand what it is and where it sits inside of your application. But basically, it helps you to have security as code inside of your Next.js app. You can apply it to API endpoints. We're going to apply it to a server action here. You can run it inside of a middleware to protect your entire app. And the difference between Arcjet that runs inside of your code versus something that is like a proxy server or like a protection that you get out of a CDN is that for those layers of protection that live outside of your application, you don't have any idea of what's happening, what is going to be returned or what's going to be blocked. Whereas with Arcjet, it runs inside of your code, so you can decide what you want to do with every specific request that comes in, what is the reason why you're denying, and decide whether or not to change anything or change any modifications in that matter. So if you go to Arcjet, you create a new app. I've already created a new app. So once you go to arcjet.com, there's a link in the description. You can create a new application. It just walks you through creating a new app, giving it a name, and selecting Next.js as the SDK. It walks you then through setting this up. So getting started with Arcjet, you can just go ahead and install the Arcjet Next application or package. Let's just do this together. So we're going to add Arcjet, and you have to set your key. I've already set this key. So once you create a new project, you're going to have this key. The second or the third step is to actually add some rules. So I've already created these rules and I'm going to copy and I'm going to show you what each of them do. So let me just go back here. Let me go to my actions. So inside of my form action, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new Arcjet client. And you can do this with these helper functions that we get out of Arcjet. So we have the Arcjet client that allows you to create a new layer of protection where you can define different measures that you want to add. So you have to pass in your key and you can set different rules. Shield is going to detect common attacks. Bot detection prevents all automated clients from submitting the form. And the fixed window is going to apply rate limiting for 5 submissions per IP within a minute. So just by exporting or creating this AG object or new instance of our Arcjet protection and defining different rules, we can now receive the request inside of our server action or API endpoint. If this was inside of an API endpoint or in a middleware, we can receive the request and decide whether or not we want to allow it or deny it And if we deny it, we can just dive in to see what the reason is and do different things there. So the next step is to actually do this part. So once I have that, now inside of my server action, what I'm going to do before even parsing the data, I'm going to call this request handler. This is a request helper function from Arcjet that allows you to get a hold of the request object, because NextJS hides the request inside of your server actions. And that's what's interesting to me, because inside of your API endpoint, you've seen rate limiting before using the request object. But in server actions, usually we don't have access to the request object. We have access to headers and cookies, but not the request object. And this is going to give you the request, this helper, so that you can pass it to your Arcjet. So ag.protect, you pass it the request object, and it makes a decision based on the rules that you have created. And we are saying if the decision is denied, so we're denying this request, we want to check to see why is that. Is it rate limit? So we're going to pass a different message. Is it because it's a bot? You are a bot. And in all other cases, we're just going to return a generic error message. And just with this few lines of code, now you have security or protection added inside of your server action. So let me go back. Am I running the dev server? No, let's rerun this. Now, if I go to my app and refresh, and now start just submitting random tasks, the Arcjet is going to kick in after the fifth one and say too many registration attempts, please try again later. So very easy. We are building a robust app that's robust form that's using server actions, so we don't have to create API endpoint. We are using the new useActionState to hook up this server action and tie it into transitions and our form action prop. We are using Zod validation to validate the data on the client side and also on the server side. And we also added another layer of protection against spam, bots, and rate limiting using Arcjet inside of our server actions. So I hope you learned something from this video. If there's any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments if you want to see more features with the forms, and specifically the new form component in NextJS 15, which is going to be useful if you want to use it like the native HTML form where it submits the action into the new URL that you have, which is going to be useful for using or building search result pages. Let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.